Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun had only begun its slow climb over the jagged desert ridge when the lone cowboy known across the frontier as Calder Boone guided his weary horse along the dusty trail leading westward. For 9 years, he had roamed the empty stretches between abandoned mining towns, cattle ranges, and Comanche hunting grounds, never rooting himself anywhere for long. The death of his family, a tragedy he carried like a permanent shadow, had sent him drifting across the plains like wind-blown grit. Each sunrise was just another day to survive, and each sunset was another reminder that no one waited for him. Calder rode in silence, his hat pulled low, listening only to the rhythmic creak of the saddle leather and the soft huffing of his mare. The desert around him shimmered with faint morning heat, its emptiness broken only by the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the trail. He preferred it this way, quiet, predictable, and absent of human complications. But fate had its own rhythm, one that paid no mind to the boundaries he built around his life. As he approached a fork in the trail, he noticed something unusual far ahead, what looked like a bundle of cloth lying motionless near a cluster of desert brush. At first he assumed it to be discarded supplies or debris blown in by the wind, but as he drew closer, he saw the faint outline of a human figure curled tightly into itself, half covered in sand, as if the desert had tried to swallow it whole. The figure was a woman. Her clothes, ragged, torn, and clinging to her skin from sweat and dust, told the story of someone who had been wandering far too long under the punishing sun. Her boots were mismatched, one almost falling apart, and her long dark hair was tangled like dry river grass. She seemed barely conscious, her head lolling to the side as Calder stopped his horse. He studied the scene with trained caution. The West had no shortage of traps, bandits staging ambushes, desperate travelers disguising their intentions, or fugitives pretending weakness. But this woman's trembling shoulders, the way her fingers loosely held onto nothing but air, and the raw exhaustion etched into every inch of her body told a truer story. She was no threat. She was barely clinging to life. The woman tried to lift her head but only managed a weak shiver. Her lips were cracked, her skin scorched, and her breathing shallow. She seemed aware of his presence but lacked the strength to react. She reached out a feeble hand, her movements slow and uncertain, as though she expected to be ignored or rejected. The desert, after all, rarely offered mercy to anyone, much less a lone woman stranded among its unforgiving sands. Calder scanned the horizon. No horse prints but hers, no wagon tracks, no campfire smoke. She truly was alone. She attempted to rise to her knees and failed, collapsing forward with a soft groan lost in the wind. With the last flicker of strength she possessed, she tried to offer herself, as countless desperate frontier women had done when they had nothing else to trade for survival, a grim practice born out of fear, starvation, and hopelessness. She clutched at the torn hem of her dress, her intent clear even in her half-conscious state. She believed the only way to earn help from a passing man was to sacrifice the little dignity she had left. But Calder Boone was not the kind of man who would ever take advantage of someone in need. Pain had shaped him, yes, hardship had hardened him, certainly, but beneath the layers of loneliness and dust, his moral compass, one forged by a family long gone, still pointed true. Without hesitation, he slid from his saddle, lifted the frail woman into his arms, and set her gently onto his horse. She went limp against the saddle horn, her breath fluttering like a trapped bird. Calder steadied her as if handling something precious, knowing that roughness alone could break someone already this close to the edge. He didn't know her name or her story, but he knew one thing: she needed saving. As he guided the reins and began walking beside the horse, he kept a steady pace so she would not jostle more than necessary. The rising sun grew hotter, casting harsh light across the empty land, but Calder's stride was unwavering. He had carried burdens far heavier than a starving woman, burdens carved into memory and bone, This one, at least, still had a chance to survive. The woman's head tilted weakly toward him. Though she could not speak, her expression flickered between disbelief and fragile hope. She had likely expected exploitation or abandonment, but both assumptions fell away as she watched him walk beside her instead of riding ahead. Calder's thoughts drifted as he led the horse. He wondered what horrors had driven her into the desert: bandits, a broken wagon train, a runaway attempt gone wrong, or perhaps a darker tragedy she'd escaped with nothing but her life. In the frontier, stories like hers were far too common, each marked by danger, betrayal, and survival born out of sheer will. Miles later, a faint shape appeared on the horizon, the ghostly outline of Lone Mesa Outpost, a half-forgotten settlement clinging to existence. It consisted of a weathered saloon, a trading post, a tired stable, and a few scattered cabins, small enough to disappear into the desert if the wind blew strong enough. But to Calder, it was the nearest place where shelter, water, and help could be found. By the time they reached the outpost, the woman was drifting in and out of consciousness. Calder took her into the abandoned deputy's cabin, a place he occasionally used when passing through, and laid her on a worn but clean bed. He fetched water from the well, soaked a cloth, and gently pressed it to her forehead. Her body shivered under the sudden coolness. He tilted her head and let drops of water fall between her cracked lips until her breathing steadied. Hours passed as he tended to her. The woman's color slowly returned, and her trembling eased. She slept fitfully but deeply, her chest rising and falling in steadier rhythms. Calder remained nearby, listening to the muffled winds swirling outside, knowing well that danger lurked across the plains even in daylight. He studied her as she slept. Her face, though gaunt from hunger, hinted at someone once strong, perhaps stubborn enough to survive the harshest storms. She bore faint bruises on her wrists, and her dress was torn not from the desert but from human hands. His jaw tightened. Whatever she had escaped from, it had not been kind, and the threat might not be far behind. As afternoon shadows stretched across the outpost, Calder sat on the cabin's porch with his rifle laid across his lap. His instincts had kept him alive for years, and right now every one of them whispered the same warning. The woman's past, the danger she fled, would soon find its way to Lone Mesa. When the first distant hoofbeats echoed faintly across the desert dusk, Calder knew the quiet would not last. But neither would the peace this woman had found in his protection. The fading desert light cast long strips of shadow across the cracked earth as Calder Boone sat on the porch of the old deputy's cabin, watching the horizon with sharpened focus. Hours earlier, he had lifted a half-starved stranger onto his horse and carried her to safety, unaware of the magnitude of the danger trailing behind her. Now, as dusk settled in, the faint but unmistakable rhythm of distant hooves carried through the cooling wind. Calder's instincts rarely misjudged a threat. A lone rider would not create such steady, synchronized beats. This was the sound of multiple horses, a small band at least, riding with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly. The kind of purpose found in men hunting something, or someone. And if this woman had escaped the grips of such men, those restless hooves belonged to the hunters. Inside the cabin, the woman stirred under the thin blanket he had pulled over her. Her breathing had steadied, but her rest was still troubled. Every movement hinted at a past heavy with fear and exhaustion. Calder hadn't asked her anything. There was no need for questions just yet. The bruises on her arms, the torn hem of her dress, and the way she had collapsed in the desert already painted a grim picture. Whatever she had fled had been cruel. Whatever followed her was capable of worse. The outpost remained quiet, nearly abandoned except for a pair of mule Skinner brothers who rarely left the saloon and an elderly stableman mostly too drunk to stand upright. None of them would be any help if trouble came. Calder knew that if danger reached Lone Mesa Outpost, he alone would stand between it and the woman lying under his roof. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing through the valleys with the low thunder of approaching menace. Calder watched the dust rise in the distance, swirling like a storm forming on open plains. He recognized the formation: 4 riders, tight grouping, moving fast. Men tracking something specific, not roaming. They were drawing nearer with every heartbeat. Calder rose to his feet, his boots crunching lightly on the porch wood. His rifle rested in his grip, but it wasn't aggression fueling him. It was readiness. The West rewarded preparedness and punished hesitation. He took slow breaths, each one deliberate, grounding himself in the moment. He had no desire for conflict, but he had even less desire to abandon someone who had already suffered more than the desert's brutality. As the shadows lengthened, the woman woke with a sudden gasp, her eyes wide with panic before she even registered where she was. Her body tensed, her hands gripping the blanket as if bracing for something or someone who might burst through the door at any moment. Calder wasn't inside to see her reaction, but he sensed it. Fear had a way of settling into the air, shifting its weight, making everything inside a room feel colder than it should. She rose weakly and staggered toward the window, peering through the small gap in the shutter. The sight of the distant riders, still far but closing the gap, sent a tremor through her. Her knees nearly buckled. The terror etched onto her gaunt face confirmed what Calder already suspected. Those men were hunting her, not merely passing through. She turned away from the window, clasping her arms tightly around herself as though trying to hold her trembling body together. Her breaths came fast and uneven. She had run from something unimaginable, something she feared more than death itself, and it was coming for her once again. Calder continued to observe from the porch, waiting to see whether the riders would change direction or head straight into the heart of the outpost. Sometimes searching parties only skirted a settlement's edges, but these men neither slowed nor veered. Their course was direct and certain. They were following a trail, her trail. By the time twilight softened into early nightfall, the riders were close enough for their silhouettes to sharpen into clear shapes against the deepening sky. As they approached the saloon, they halted. Spurs jingled softly as they dismounted, their horses snorting clouds of heat into the cool air. Though Calder could not hear their words, their body language spoke louder than shouts. These were rough men, confident and accustomed to violence. They scanned the outpost with the intent eyes of predators searching for prey. Inside the cabin, the woman pressed herself against the wall, moving instinctively toward the darkest corner of the room. Her memories of these men, or those like them, were carved too deeply into her bones for her to stay still. She didn't dare approach the door, even though she sensed her protector was just beyond it. Her body refused to trust the safety she'd been given. Fear had trained her to expect betrayal, no matter how undeserved. Calder remained still, watching, analyzing, waiting for the riders' next move. He knew confrontation was unavoidable if they came closer. Even if they didn't intend to cause harm to the outpost itself, they wouldn't leave without taking what they believed was theirs. Men like them rarely allowed anything, or anyone, to slip out of their grasp without bloodshed. After a moment of tense stillness, the riders split up. Two headed toward the saloon to pry information out of its few patrons. The other two moved toward the stables, likely searching for unfamiliar horses, tracks, or signs of someone stopping unexpectedly in the area. Their strategy was clear. They knew the woman couldn't have gotten far alone, and they intended to question everyone until they found a lead. The woman inside the cabin clutched at the small wooden crate beside the bed, her breath shallow and frantic. She spotted her faint reflection in the tin basin near the washstand, hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and fear etched into every line of her face. She had been hunted for days, maybe weeks. Hope was something she had been forced to bury long ago. But now, with the riders closing in, that fragile flame flickered dangerously, threatening to extinguish under the weight of terror. Calder stepped off the porch and moved to stand beside the door, keeping out of sight while still listening to every sound in the outpost. The boots of the strangers thudded heavily across the boards of the saloon porch. Angry, gesturing silhouettes could be seen inside through the dusty window panes. The Mule Skinner brothers were likely too scared, or too drunk, to offer any useful responses. The men near the stables weren't any quieter. They kicked open empty stalls, checked feed barrels, and groaned in frustration as they failed to find any clear signs. But signs were there. They just didn't know what to search for. Calder's mare was tied behind the cabin instead of inside the stables, hidden from view, making it harder for the riders to detect the presence of a newcomer. Still, it was only a matter of time before they expanded their search to the far end of the outpost. If they checked each cabin, they would eventually reach the one where the woman was hiding. The woman sensed this inevitability. She moved to the corner nearest the door, sinking to the floor, covering herself with the blanket as though it could make her disappear. Her thoughts spiraled through her memories, nights of captivity, harsh treatment, cruel negotiations over her freedom. Desperation had driven her into the desert. But desperation had also taught the men chasing her that she was valuable in ways no human being should ever be considered. Calder glanced toward the horizon once more. Night had fallen completely, giving him the cover he needed. He stepped silently back into the cabin, closing the door behind him with a careful hand. The woman looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, her breath catching in her throat. But Calder's calm presence, as steady as the earth beneath them, slowed her panic just enough to keep her from collapsing into another wave of fear. Outside, Boots approached, slow, heavy, purposeful. The riders had begun checking the cabins. The first knock echoed like a hammer against the silence of the night, and the search for the woman had reached their door. The night around Lone Mesa Outpost had fallen silent, save for the slow, deliberate approach of Boots on dry earth, moving steadily from one cabin to the next. Deep within the abandoned deputy's cabin, Calder Boone stood unmoving, his hand resting loosely near his rifle, his breath steady, his thoughts sharper than steel. Outside, the tension in the air grew thicker with each heavy footstep, each shift of gravel beneath searching boots. The riders had begun their hunt in earnest, determined to uncover the one trail they believed had not yet gone cold. Inside the cabin, the woman he had rescued from the desert remained curled against the shadowed wall, her trembling fingers gripping the blanket wrapped around her thin frame. Her eyes flicked toward the door with the terrified alertness of someone who had listened to too many footsteps approach with cruel intentions. Shadows from passing lanterns spilled through the cracks in the wooden shutters, sweeping across her face like ghosts of the past, reaching out to reclaim her. Calder kept his posture relaxed, though every muscle in his body was primed. His senses were tuned to the environment, to the soft creak of the saloon sign swaying in the distant wind, to the faint snort of horses tied near the outpost's well, and most importantly, to the shifting silence that preceded the first knock. When the riders stopped directly outside the cabin, the woman's breath hitched, and she pressed herself deeper into the corner, as though trying to melt into the wood. The knock came, slow, deliberate, heavy, echoing through the small cabin with a force that seemed disproportionate to the actual sound. It wasn't just a knock, it was a declaration of power. A reminder that the world outside the thin wooden door was filled with men who believed they had the right to take whatever they sought. Their confidence came from long histories of violence and the certainty that the weak had no protection in the unforgiving West. The woman squeezed her eyes shut, memories resurfacing in jagged fragments, harsh nights, rough hands, shouted threats, and the hollow promises of freedom she had never been granted. She remembered fleeing under cover of night, knowing that if she stayed another day her fate would be sealed in ways she could not bear to imagine. The desert had nearly claimed her life, but even that fate felt preferable to returning to the men who now stood on the other side of Calder's door. Calder did not move. He knew opening the door would escalate the encounter, but refusing to open it risked provoking the riders even more. The situation teetered on the edge of breaking, like a frayed rope strained beyond its limits. The West was unpredictable, and there were no guarantees which path would lead to survival. Outside, the riders shifted impatiently. The faint crunch of boots signaled their growing frustration. They checked windows, peered into shadows, and scanned the nearby ground for signs of movement. Calder knew they had likely questioned those inside the saloon and received little useful information. They were thorough, determined, and too familiar with tracking fugitives to abandon their search easily. The woman's fear grew with each passing second. Her heart pounded loud enough she feared the riders might hear it through the walls. She watched Calder, noticing the calm in his stance, the steadiness in his breathing. His presence alone anchored the whirlwind inside her. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt the faintest thread of hope, thin, fragile, yet powerful enough to momentarily pull her from the brink of panic. But hope did not silence the men outside. After a moment of tense stillness, the riders moved on, their boots scraping against the dirt as they headed toward the next cabin. The woman exhaled shakily, the blanket slipping from her grasp. She stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open even as the footsteps drifted farther away. Calder listened until the last trace of their presence faded into the distance. The silence that returned was heavy, not peaceful. It was the silence of uncertainty, of danger still looming just beyond reach. The riders had not left the outpost, they were simply widening their search. There was no relief to be found, no safety in the cabin walls, no guarantee that the night would pass without confrontation. The woman remained awake even as hours dragged by. The cabin's lamp burned low, casting dim, wavering light across the rough wooden floor. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind set her nerves aflame. Calder had given her safety, for now, but safety in the west was temporary at best. She knew that once the riders completed their sweep of the outpost, they would circle back, more aggressive, more certain, more unwilling to accept empty answers. As the moon climbed higher into the sky, Calder began to plan their next move. The outpost was too exposed, too small to hide anyone for long. If the riders remained overnight, and they likely would, leaving before dawn would be their only chance. The darkness could offer them cover, and distance could give them time. But traveling with an exhausted, injured woman was risky. Her strength was slowly returning, yet her body remained frail from days without rest, water, or food. Still, staying was not an option. Inside the cabin, the woman's mind fought exhaustion until her body finally overpowered it. She drifted into a restless sleep filled with half-formed nightmares, each one pulling her back to the faces she feared most. Her breathing grew uneven at times, interrupted by sudden jolts, but eventually she slipped into deeper rest. Calder took the time to quietly prepare supplies. He packed enough food for a few days, filled extra canteens, and checked the saddlebags for wear. His movements were silent, practiced from years of traveling alone and avoiding unnecessary noise. He glanced toward the woman occasionally, ensuring her sleep remained undisturbed. She needed whatever rest her body could claim before they attempted an escape. Outside, lanterns flickered from the saloon and stables. The riders showed no intent to depart. Their horses were tied and watered. Their boots remained planted in the dirt as they guarded the outpost's entrances, their shadows stretching long under the dim glow of night. They were watching, waiting, confident that the woman they hunted would inevitably reveal herself. Hours passed before the faint light of early dawn began to touch the horizon. The sky shifted from pitch black to a muted gray-blue. Calder moved toward the window, observing the riders who had settled near the saloon porch. Some rested, others kept watch. Their formation told him everything he needed to know. They expected movement. They expected her to run. Calder turned back toward the woman just as she stirred awake. Her eyes opened slowly, heavy with fatigue yet filled with the quiet realization that dawn had arrived. She rose to sit on the edge of the bed, holding the blanket around her shoulders. Her gaze met Calder's briefly before shifting toward the shuttered window, sensing the presence of danger lingering just outside. The time had come to move. Calder strapped the last buckle, adjusted his hat, and ensured his rifle sat securely at his side. The woman pulled herself to her feet, her legs unsteady but determined. She knew her survival depended on leaving with him. Whatever he planned, whatever path he intended to take, she would follow. Her life no longer belonged to fear. It now depended on this stranger who had shown her more compassion in one afternoon than others had shown her in years. As they stood in the dim cabin, ready to slip into the uncertain dawn, the world outside grew sharper with the sounds of waking riders. They had not slept long nor well. The hunt was not over. In fact, it was only beginning. The faint light of dawn crept slowly over Lone Mesa Outpost, brushing the worn rooftops and sagging porches with a thin layer of pale gold. It was the kind of light that made everything appear softer than it truly was, masking the danger coiled tightly beneath the surface. In the old deputy's cabin, Calder Boone stood in a silent moment of calculation, listening to the subtle shift of the morning wind, the faint snort of restless horses, and the hard footsteps of the riders who had hunted the woman now standing behind him. The woman clutched the blanket around her shoulders, her breath steady but laced with the tremor of anticipation. She sensed the urgency in Calder's posture. She felt the weight of danger pressing against the walls. Dawn had not brought safety. It had only brought clarity. The riders who had come after her were awake, armed, and waiting. Calder pushed open the back door slowly, revealing a narrow path leading behind the abandoned stables, hidden from the main trail where the riders had gathered. His mare stood quietly in the shadows, saddlebags secured, and reins tied loosely to a beam. The dust around her hooves remained undisturbed, proof that the hunters had not yet considered searching this far into the outpost's forgotten corners. The woman followed him outside, her steps unsteady but purposeful. The cold morning air bit at her skin, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was alive, free for the moment, and moving away from the men who had treated her as nothing more than property. She pulled the blanket tighter as she approached the horse, feeling a mix of fear and gratitude swelling inside her. Calder's kindness had been the pivot between life and death, between captivity and freedom. Calder lifted her onto the horse once more, ensuring she was balanced securely before taking hold of the reins himself. He stayed on foot, moving alongside the mare just as he had in the desert, steady, protective, and silent. He led her around the backside of the outpost, avoiding the main street where the riders kept watch. Every step was calculated to avoid leaving fresh tracks where the ground was soft. The sun rose slowly behind them, casting long shadows that stretched across the barren land. Calder guided them through a narrow ravine flanked by jagged stones, a route invisible from the outpost and rarely used except by those who knew the land better than they knew themselves. Few riders ever thought to search there. Its entrance was hidden behind boulders and overgrown brush, making it the perfect escape path for someone who needed to vanish without leaving a trail. The woman held onto the saddle horn tightly, her eyes scanning the shifting terrain. Every distant sound made her heart jolt, convinced the riders had discovered their escape and were closing in. But the only noises that reached them were the rustle of brush under the morning wind and the gentle thud of the mare's hooves on the packed earth. As the ravine stretched onward, the outpost grew smaller behind them until it faded completely from sight. The woman's breathing steadied, but the fear lingered like a shadow she could not outrun. Freedom was not yet secure, it merely lay ahead, fragile and uncertain. Calder continued leading the horse for hours, stopping only when the sun climbed high and the first hints of heat began to settle into the ravine's tight walls. He paused beneath the shade of a rocky overhang, letting the horse rest and allowing the woman to drink from a canteen. She sipped slowly, conserving every drop, aware of how precious water was in the unforgiving landscape. The ravine eventually opened into a wide stretch of scrubland bordered by distant hills. It was here, in the open expanse, that the woman began to understand the enormity of the West. The land seemed endless, wild, and indifferent to human struggle. Yet she felt safer in its vastness than she ever had in the confined spaces where she had been held captive. The open space offered possibility. Danger, yes, but also hope. Calder lifted her down from the mare, allowing her legs to stretch. She moved stiffly, her muscles aching from days of exhaustion. Yet there was a determined spark in her movements, a quiet resilience that had begun to surface, now that she was away from immediate harm. Her fear had not vanished, but it no longer controlled her every breath. Calder scanned the horizon. Dust rising in the distance would signal riders. Shimmering heat waves could distort the truth. The West was deceptive, hiding danger until it was nearly upon you. He studied every movement of the wind, every shift in the terrain. The woman watched him, sensing the weight he carried, the responsibility of protecting her, the danger he willingly embraced. After a brief rest, they resumed their journey. Calder mounted the mare this time and carefully positioned the woman behind him. Though she was still weakened, her grip around him was steady. He urged the mare into a slow but purposeful trot, aiming for the foothills where rocky terrain would make tracking more difficult. As they traveled, the woman's thoughts drifted to the events that had brought her to the middle of the desert. She remembered the night she fled, the shouting, the struggle, the realization that running alone into the wilderness was her only chance. She had expected to die under the desert sun, yet she had chosen that fate over remaining in captivity. The memory haunted her, but now it carried a new layer. She had survived long enough to be found by someone who refused to take advantage of her desperation, someone who saw her humanity, even when she had been stripped of everything else. By midday, the heat intensified. Calder guided the mare through a cluster of rock formations that provided natural shelter. They stopped briefly, allowing the horse to rest and the woman to breathe in the stillness. The silence felt different away from the outpost, less threatening, more peaceful. Yet beneath that peace lay an undercurrent of caution. Calder knew the riders would eventually discover their escape, and once they did, they would not stop until they reclaimed what they believed was theirs. Hours passed as the mare carried them deeper into the hills. The terrain grew rugged, dotted with scrub oak and steep inclines where loose stones shifted under each step. The woman clung tightly as the horse maneuvered through narrow passes, trusting Calder's skill and experience to keep them safe. Late in the afternoon, Calder halted near a ridge overlooking a valley. From this vantage point, the land stretched far into the horizon, untouched and solitary. He scanned the western edge of the valley, and there, in the distance, a faint plume of dust rose. The riders had found their trail. Though far away, they were moving with purpose, following the general direction Calder had taken. The distance was great enough to buy time, but the threat had returned with the force of an oncoming storm. The woman sensed the tension in Calder's body. She turned her gaze toward the distant dust, her heart sinking. The hunters were relentless, fueled by cruelty and determination. Running would not be enough. They would need outsmarting, evasion, and perhaps even confrontation. Calder adjusted the reins, his mind already working through the terrain ahead. The valley offered pathways to hide, but it also offered risks. It was a place where decisions had consequences and mistakes could cost lives. The chase was no longer a possibility, it had already begun. The plume of dust rising on the far horizon became the driving force behind every decision Calder Boone made as he guided the mare down from the ridge and into the valley floor. The woman clinging behind him felt the tightening tension in his frame, each subtle shift of his posture signaling the growing urgency. The riders were far, yet not far enough. The open land between them stretched wide, but the dust trail proved that distance meant little when men were driven by obsession. The valley below was a sprawling expanse of rugged terrain, flanked by jagged stone walls and dotted with thick patches of sagebrush. The land formed a natural maze of shallow ravines and steep inclines, shaped over centuries by relentless winds and rare seasonal floods. Few travelers crossed this place willingly, for its pathways twisted unpredictably, and its narrow passes could funnel a lone rider into dead ends. It was both a haven and a trap, depending on who knew the land better. Calder had passed through the valley years ago and remembered enough of its contours to sense its hidden roots. The woman behind him could feel his confidence, even as fear churned within her chest. She could sense the determination in his movements, the certainty that he would not let those who hunted her claim victory. His resolve wrapped around her like a shield, even when her body trembled with exhaustion. They rode deeper into the valley, crossing a dried creek bed where the earth was cracked from years without rain. The mare's hooves kicked up fine dust that drifted behind them in soft spirals. Calder guided her toward the narrowest of paths, flanked by steep walls of stone that rose like ancient fortresses guarding the land. The path offered cover from the rider's line of sight, but it also limited their escape routes. Still, Calder chose the path with purpose, a decision rooted not in desperation but in strategy. The woman studied the rocks towering above them. Their rough surfaces bore the scars of time, cracks from heat, grooves carved by winds, and ledges eroded by long-forgotten storms. She traced the landscape with wary eyes, recognizing how foreign and unyielding the West could be. Every shadow appeared as a threat, every distant echo made her pulse quicken. And yet she sensed they were moving toward something, toward a place where Calder believed they could gain an advantage. Hours passed as the sun climbed higher. The heat pressed down upon them like an invisible hand, draining their strength with each passing moment. Calder halted the mare when they reached a narrow alcove sheltered beneath a protruding ledge. It was a natural hideaway, barely large enough for the horse and the two travelers, but perfectly concealed from any searching riders passing above. The woman slid from the saddle, her legs trembling as exhaustion took hold. Calder steadied her before guiding the mare deeper into the shaded pocket. The coolness of the stone was a welcome relief from the relentless heat outside. While she rested against the rock wall, Calder scanned the valley mouth through a slender crack between boulders. The dust plume behind them had grown wider. The riders had split into two groups, one following their tracks directly, and the other fanning out in an attempt to cut them off. The woman's breathing slowly evened as she sat on the cool ground. A faint weariness washed over her, but she fought the urge to sleep. She knew that rest could lure her into a false sense of safety, and the last thing she wanted was to become a burden that slowed their escape. Still, the ache in her limbs and the heaviness in her eyelids revealed the truth. Her strength was waning. Calder observed her silently, noting the fatigue etched into her face. Though she fought to remain alert, her body no longer possessed the stamina needed for long travel. He knew the valley would test them both, but it would drain her faster than him. That reality shaped his next choice. When the sun dipped slightly from its highest point, casting elongated shadows across the land, Calder led the mare out of the alcove and deeper along a narrow passage that curved behind a wall of sedimentary stone. The path was steep, forcing the mare to climb with deliberate, careful movements. The woman held tightly, her pulse thundering in her ears as they ascended. She dared not look down, for one misplaced step would send them hurtling into the ravine below. At the top of the incline, they emerged onto a flat stretch hidden from the valley floor. Here, a network of stone formations rose in irregular patterns, creating a labyrinth of natural corridors. Calder navigated them with slow precision, choosing routes that minimized their tracks and avoided open ground. Every decision he made was rooted in experience earned through years of wandering the frontier. Experience that often meant the difference between life and death. Below, the riders had reached the valley. Dust clouds swirled behind them as they galloped into the wide expanse, splitting apart in search of fresh tracks. Their frustration was visible even from a distance. The valley's hard earth swallowed signs of movement quickly, and Calder's careful choices left little behind for them to follow. But these men were persistent. Their determination had already carried them across miles of harsh landscape. Calder knew they would not turn back easily. As sunset approached, the sky transformed into a vast canvas of amber and crimson. Calder and the woman reached a vantage point where the valley stretched endlessly before them. The beauty of the land felt strange against the backdrop of danger, but as the woman watched the horizon glow with fading light, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Not safety yet, not freedom, but hope. They descended into a sheltered canyon where sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet into the sky, carved by ages of wind and water. The canyon's winding floor offered a rare gift, fresh water seeping from a crack in the wall, forming a small pool. Calder guided the mare to drink, then helped the woman sip from the natural spring. She drank slowly, grateful for the refreshing coolness that revived her strength. The woman leaned against the canyon wall, letting the damp air wash over her. It felt like the first moment of peace she had known since she fled into the desert. Her mind drifted to the life she had lost, the suffering she endured, and the terrifying journey that had brought her here. And through those thoughts moved the constant presence of Calder Boone, quiet, steady, unyielding in his resolve to protect her. Night descended fully, bringing cooler winds that whispered through the canyon. The air shifted, carrying the faint echoes of distant hoofbeats once more. The riders had not stopped. Their hunt continued. Calder extinguished their small fire before it truly formed, ensuring no smoke betrayed their presence. Darkness swallowed the canyon, turning the world into a place of silhouettes and shadows. The woman shivered, not from cold, but from the knowledge that darkness brought concealment and danger. The hoofbeats grew louder. The riders were entering the canyon. Calder positioned himself near the narrow mouth of the canyon floor, his silhouette merging with the shadows. The woman crouched behind a fallen boulder, her breath silent, her heart pounding. The mare stood still as stone behind them, trained to silence by instinct alone. The canyon amplified every sound, every hoofstep, every shift of rock, making it impossible to know exactly how many riders had drawn near, but it was clear that the hunt had led them to this place. The woman clenched her trembling hands. Calder remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the dark passage ahead. The riders were close, too close. And this time, hiding might not be enough. The morning after the long night in the abandoned canyon brought with it a strange and gentle quiet. It was the kind of stillness that settled only after danger had passed, when the land itself seemed to exhale in relief. The sun rose slowly, casting copper and gold across the horizon, touching the rocks, the grass, the distant line of the river, and the two figures who had survived more than the land had ever meant for them to face. The cowboy rose first, his body sore but steady, his instincts shaped by years on the frontier. He surveyed the landscape with care, his mind already preparing for the uncertainties the new day might carry. And beside him, the woman who had once offered her body for a ride, so desperate, so frightened, now rested in a state that spoke not of despair, but of hope. She moved with slow breaths, curled beneath the blanket he had given her, the horse grazing peacefully nearby. The storm that had once raged between her past and her future seemed to have quieted. For the first time since he had found her walking aimlessly along the dusty road, she slept without fear tightening her shoulders. The cowboy watched her rest, understanding that the path ahead would demand decisions neither of them had been ready to make the day before. He knew her world was still broken. He knew his own had been painfully empty, and yet the bond that had grown between them, through dust storms, through danger, through long stretches of silence, now felt as solid as the earth beneath their boots. When she finally rose, the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Her eyes carried the weight of everything she had endured, but also the strength of someone who had finally glimpsed a future worth walking toward. The cowboy had expected the familiar flicker of fear or uncertainty in her expression, but there was none. Instead, she stood tall, as if the night had restored something she once believed she had lost forever. She looked around the canyon with a softness that came only from understanding one's own survival. The land that had nearly taken her life had also given her clarity, and that clarity now shaped the air between them. Together, they packed the meager supplies that remained and prepared to continue their ride toward the distant settlement. The cowboy lifted her onto the horse with quiet care, the same care that had defined every choice he had made since their paths first crossed. She no longer trembled at his touch. She no longer lowered her gaze in shame. Whatever she had once offered out of desperation had transformed into something neither had spoken, but both understood. He mounted behind her, steady and strong, and the two began their slow trek toward the horizon. As they traveled, the land unfurled around them, stretching into wide plains and distant hills. Birds circled overhead, and the wind carried the scent of early spring, grass warming under sunlight, river water rising, earth waking from winter's grip. It was a season of renewal, and it seemed fitting that their story had reached this moment now. The woman leaned lightly back against him, no longer afraid of her nearness, no longer apologizing for her existence. The cowboy guided the horse with the same calm certainty he had shown since he first told her that she was safe. Hours passed, and the settlement finally appeared on the horizon, a cluster of wooden buildings, thin trails of smoke, the faint movement of people who had built their lives out of stubborn will and resilience. She stared at the town with a mixture of longing and dread. For her, it represented both opportunity and the risk of returning to a world where her past might catch up to her. The cowboy sensed her hesitation and slowed the horse, understanding the silent battle happening inside her heart. But he also understood that she deserved more than a life lived running from shadows. As they entered the settlement, curious eyes followed them. The townsfolk rarely saw strangers arrive together in such a state, especially not a woman whose clothes bore the wear of the trail, and a man whose silence spoke of hardships weathered alone. Yet there was something about the way the cowboy rode, upright, protective, unwavering, that kept judgment at bay. The sheriff gave a long look, assessing the pair, but eventually turned away, recognizing that whatever story lay between them was not one that needed disturbance. The cowboy guided her first to the general store, ensuring she had what she needed: clean clothing, food, and the assurance that she would no longer face the world empty-handed. She moved through the space with slow, uncertain steps, overwhelmed by the simple abundance around her. Shelves filled with cloth, soap, flour, and supplies reminded her of how long she had lived at the edge of survival. She realized then that she was no longer walking alone, no longer begging for mercy from cruel men or unforgiving roads. She was rebuilding, step by steady step. Outside, the cowboy waited, leaning against his horse. He watched her through the window, noticing the way she touched each item gently, the way she held herself, stronger now, steadier, as though claiming her place in the world for the first time. He felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar but welcome. He had once believed loneliness to be his companion for life, a silent shadow on every journey. But meeting her had stirred memories of what it felt like to care, to protect, to hope. When she emerged from the store, carrying a small bundle of necessities, the look they shared carried months' worth of unspoken truths. They walked together through the streets, passing the blacksmith, the saloon, the livery. The settlement buzzed with life, but around the two of them, the world felt unusually still, and finally, at the far edge of town, they reached a quiet field overlooking the river, a place untouched by noise or prying eyes. There, under the wide sky, the woman finally understood what the cowboy had been offering her since the moment he placed her on his horse. It had never been charity, never pity, never obligation. It had been sanctuary, strength, a chance at a future she had long believed impossible. She stood beside him as the wind swept across the grass, whispering through the tall blades like a blessing. The cowboy did not need to explain his intentions. His every action had already spoken for him. With the sun beginning to set, the sky turning shades of amber and rose, the woman felt her past fall away like dust carried off by the breeze. She knew she could choose to stay in the settlement, to start anew with the help she had been given. Or she could choose to remain by the cowboy's side, riding beside him into whatever life awaited them on the endless frontier. And though the choice was hers alone, her heart had quietly decided long before this moment. She stepped closer to him, feeling the warmth of his presence steady her. She knew now that safety was not simply the absence of danger, it was the presence of someone who saw value in her even when she could not see it in herself. And the cowboy, lonely, steadfast, honorable, had given her that without ever asking for anything in return. As the last light of the day stretched across the land, the cowboy lifted her onto his horse one final time. But this time, it was not an act of rescue. It was the beginning of a life they would build together. A life shaped not by desperation, but by trust, respect, and the quiet but powerful bond they had forged across miles of unforgiving wilderness. The horizon lay open before them, and with the steady rhythm of hooves beneath them, they disappeared into the glowing dusk, two souls who had found peace, purpose, and love where they least expected it. And the land whispered after them, as if blessing the journey that had just begun.